wrestling power!
The 550 horsepower package is dead. Long live the 670 horsepower package. Major bombshell today as NASCAR's Steve O'Donnell confirmed he's liked what he's seen in NASCAR's most recent tests at Charlotte Motor Speedway, where the 550 horsepower package went head-to-head against the 670 horsepower package, and the higher horsepower won. In this video, we will be talking all sorts of NASCAR Next Gen. Let's get into it. The thing everyone is talking about today is that NASCAR appears to have listened to its fans, competitors, some teams, and let's be honest, mostly everyone, by stating an intention to increase horsepower at all but 3 tracks on the NASCAR Cup Series schedule next year. Now, every track except for Daytona, Talladega, and Atlanta will use the 670 horsepower package, while those 3 super speedways will use a special 510 horsepower package. Now, what is the difference and what does it visually look like when a NASCAR Next Gen car is using 550 horsepower versus 670 horsepower? Here's a video comparison posted on Twitter by Christian Espinoza, and it gives you a little bit of a sense of what it looks like. Now, Bob Pockrass, who largely is the greatest NASCAR reporter of all time, posted this video on Twitter of Steve O'Donnell at the press conference today confirming this. And I want to play it because I think you guys need to hear Steve O'Donnell's own words before I give my own opinion on this news.
I think it's within a range, Bob. So if we go 670, that's absolutely within a range to attract a new OEM. We've had discussions with a number of new OEMs and have factors within that, so that wouldn't be a detriment to someone coming into the sport. I would say we're more than likely going with that number across all of our tracks. We've still got kind of a few boxes to check post-test here where we get together with our OEs and the teams and just confirm that's the direction we want to go with. But everything we've seen so far tells us that that's the horsepower we want to target and go with. Right? It's how much drag's built into this car, and so when you look at a 550 package, to produce some of the similar results you saw, the horsepower levels would have to be so low that we just don't think it's the right move at this point. You could certainly go out there and run 550, but from what we've seen in comparison to 550 to 670, we lean more towards 670. Certainly a little bit more spread out when you restart a race, but with the tire wear and what Goodyear's been able to do, what you're seeing is kind of that comers and goers that we used to have in racing. The ability to kind of maintain speeds, and at this point it's just getting the drivers to a comfort level where you can run too wide, where you have the ability to pass, and where we don't have that wake that's so noticeable in the past. So I think it's a balance between where we were with maybe a restart of 5 laps of 3 wide to harder to pass during a run, to where as you look at this package, you're going to see hopefully some movement throughout the field throughout a run.
So let's talk about this first, which is that this is good news. I think the fact, even under the circumstances that they got there, this should please the fans a little bit. And in a time in NASCAR where it seems as though, I don't want to say they're not considering the fans. I think they're just considering the opinions of the wrong fans, if that makes sense. I think if you look at a lot of the fan council answers that have been leaked online, and everybody's kind of talked about those, it seems like the way they poll fans and the way they get their opinions are definitely manipulated to get the answers that NASCAR themselves actually want, and not necessarily the answers that maybe the fans want. I know a lot of people are going to say, well, it's not 2014, and it's not 900 horsepower, or it's not like even further back, if you go back to some of the Gen 4 like qualifying motors that were producing upwards of 1,000 horsepower. Yes, it's not that. However, a 120 horsepower increase in any other form of racing, say let's for example sports cars, An extra 120 horsepower would move you up a class. Say if you're running in IMSA or if you're running in SRO, you would go up a class. You would be that much faster that you would have to be completely not racing the cars that you're currently racing. Even in dirt racing, that's kind of the similar thing. Like there's various classes of sprint cars, and the horsepower differences are substantial enough that, hey, you got to change class. So that's something. That's how big of a change 120 horsepower is with this car. So, and you can even see it in the videos that have been posted. You look at the 550 horsepower practice races, and the cars seem to be all over the place, and dirty air is a pretty big factor. With the 670 horsepower package, you see a little bit less of that. Now, why is that? Well, it seems as though NASCAR has designed a car in which it does not function as well if it has less horsepower and thus less speed on the track. Why is that? It is because the next-gen car has a flat bottom as well as ground effects, some ground effects with a diffuser on the rear of the car. And how that works, if you're not someone who's familiar with like sports cars and open wheel cars that have been using ground effects since the late 1970s, the slower you go in a ground effects car, the less effect the ground effects have. And in fact, sometimes it can work to your detriment. For example, I've covered the rookie test at Indianapolis at the Indianapolis 500, and the toughest phase for rookies to pass is not when you're running 220 plus miles an hour. The toughest phases of the test are when you have to run around 200, 210 miles an hour consistently, because of the fact that the Indy car runs more efficiently and generates more downforce at 220 plus than it does at 210 and below. So that's why you see a lot of times, for example, Indy cars crashing when they're off throttle, they're backing off of the throttle, and all of a sudden the car goes whoop and spins around. You're seeing a lot of that as well with the next-gen car. If you're paying attention, a lot of times when the drivers are lifting off the throttle or they're behind somebody and they have to back off the gas, I think we saw with Ricky Stenhouse this happen, they lose the downforce from the underside of the car because the car is actually, as they're losing speed, they're losing topside downforce, and that's lifting that bottom of the car off of the ground, and whoop, around they go. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see throughout the year, is how can the teams get that bottom side aerodynamic force? And the teams, I think, that figure that out first are going to be the ones that are going to the front. But that's not the only thing kind of that's a concern around the next-gen car. And perhaps this is the biggest concern, at least according to one team owner. And that is the supply issues with the NASCAR next-gen car. Now, I spoke to a few teams at PRI. Now, it should be noted that these teams were not chartered teams, and that's going to be a very important key going forward. But because the next-gen car was so stiff initially, NASCAR has had to make some changes to the chassis as they've been testing it, which, again, I kind of expected when a lot of those early reports of the crash test dummies dying came out. That's all part of the testing process. The front and rear clips are being changed on the next-gen car. There's been some things done to them to make them softer, to make the car overall less stiff, especially in an impact, though also it works with handling. A lot of teams have not received a whole lot of these parts. Now, there are a lot of next-gen cars out in the world, but not all of them are spec'd to what NASCAR's current regulations are, if that makes sense. So, for example, all of the cars that were at PRI were a spec below what is currently being tested at Charlotte right now. Now, the concern is, especially at Daytona, is going to be once you start crashing cars, how many spare parts are going to be available. Now, Brad Keselowski, who is now a team owner, or part team owner at Roush Keselowski Racing, I think they call it now, RFK, Roush Fenway Keselowski, yes, that's right, said this. This is the largest concern of the next gen to date and will correct itself appropriately over time. The positive is that the cars are so far proving to be a significant improvement in terms of how they require talent to drive and cost and operate compared to years past. I think he's subtly referring to the horsepower increases over the testing of the next-gen car. Now, it's important to also note that Steve O'Donnell also talked in the presser about this issue. Again, this video comes from Bob Pockris. Just want you to hear what Steve has to say.
Certainly, we've had conversations with all of our vendors to ensure that we're going to be in a good place to start the season, and we feel very comfortable about the numbers that we'll have. So, I've seen rumors out there that teams will only have one car or two cars. That's not the case. We expect to be at a minimum of 5 per car number, with front and rear clips, potentially 2 or more for each, up to potentially 7, but I'd say probably 5. And I think what's important to keep in mind is this is a totally different model. So, teams are used to having as many cars as they want or need, but we believe that'll be a sufficient inventory to get us through kind of that first quarter of the season, and then we'll continue to build and learn. And we've said all along that we don't expect teams to have as many cars in their inventory going forward. That was part of this model. And then around different parts and pieces, it is a new model. It's a new way of, and it's a new culture.
So to my understanding, what Steve is talking about here and what Brad is talking about here is that, yes, put it this way, there definitely is a part shortage right now. Will there be a part shortage when they get to Daytona? Probably not. However, I do think at this point there will not be a full field at Daytona. Now, am I totally 100% on that? No. Remember, a full field is 40 cars. So you've got the 36 chartered teams and then 4 non-chartered teams showing up for the Daytona 500. Now, that's obviously a big race on a big stage, and I think it's logical or reasonable to assume that they will eventually scrounge together 40 cars. But I also think it's logical and reasonable to assume that they won't get to 40 cars by Daytona. And then, of course, you have to think that if there's some crashes in the duels or crashes in practice or crashes in qualifying, and especially with those smaller teams, what parts availability is there going to be? I learned recently, though I did not learn this at PRI, that one of the reasons the charters, A, are valued at $10 million currently, and why 2311 paid $3.5 million over market value to get a charter for this year is because of this. Chartered teams are being given priority on not only spare parts, but new parts that are going to be required to run the next gen in NASCAR competition next year. So, not only are you, by being a chartered team, having quite a head start over non-chartered teams, but you have to also realize that this chassis is being planned to be used for at least the next decade and possibly longer in the history of NASCAR. So, if you don't get your homework done early on, you are going to be behind the eight ball for a very long time in terms of chassis development. And so, because the fact that 2311 paid that $3.5 million now, potentially they are saving themselves from being uncompetitive with Kurt Busch's car for a very long time. Interesting times we are living in, no doubt about it. So, next-gen testing will continue into 2022. Actually, one of the first tests of the year is going to be at the Daytona International Speedway. That is on January the 11th. I am planning on being there. It's going to be free and open to the public. I'll put together some sort of a testing video, kind of in the style I do for IndyCar and sports cars. It'll be kind of fun to do that for Daytona and give you guys a good preview of potentially what to expect at the Daytona 500. It'll be interesting to see how much pack running they do there, and also the potential of a 2013 style pileup. That would be a disaster, by the way, if that did happen, because then you're going to have to really scramble to get parts together for the Daytona 500, in which it seems like there's already going to be a concern about spare parts, at least at that event. So, that's next gen. They're increasing the horsepower. That's good. There are still some concerns, but it does seem, and I will give NASCAR credit on this, does seem like things are heading in a positive direction with the next-gen car. It's going to be one of the biggest stories of the year in NASCAR, and we're going to keep following it. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Subscribe for more motorsport content, and I will see you in the next video.